If there were an increase in the capacity of park and ride station car parks, would that generate additional traffic?
They're not full. They're 90% full.
Okay.
They are perceived to be full, and Marks Tay does get full. But it's I mean, at Chelmsford, you've obviously got to take in the parks, the car parks that are adjacent. But I don't have problems in parking in the centre of Chelmsford, I have to say, and that's within 5 minutes of the railway. It's not perceived as cheap, and people are doing the right sort of things. I mean, there's double the number of cycles that there were at Chelmsford, over 2,000 now. It's almost like the Netherlands, isn't it, as to what there were 10 years ago. And more people are actually walking or using motorcycles. And I mean, that's going to sort of continue, I suspect, with the pressures on cost of keeping a second car to sit in a railway car park. Obviously at Manningtree we do need to expand the car park. There's a plan for that, and I've mentioned two places where I think you could do it strategically with North East Chelmsford if that comes in 2014, and Marks Tay is probably there to be done fairly quickly, and certainly we've had discussions with the county about that in the past.
But you wouldn't say at the moment that there is a lot of unmet demand because people cannot park?
Haven't been able to generate the business cases, and even if I generated the business cases, I couldn't generate the planning cases at places like Witham and Cofidon. But Manningtree would be a helpful one, and doing something south of Colchester and north of Chelmsford must be on the agenda.
And with the increasing use of other modes of access to the stations that you mentioned, walking, cycling, motorcycle, etc.
Bus actually is relevant as well, and I guess with bus, if we actually move towards an ITSO situation with money being taken off, that might make it a bit easier. But 10% of our people into Chelmsford come in by bus. It's one of the top 10 bus locations in the country for rail business. Interestingly, actually, first have extended the span of their intensive inner town services to cover the evening peak, because with buses it's usually 6 to 6, which doesn't fit with travelling to and from London. But did actually get them to the point where they made a commercial case to push the frequencies up to 8.
The general level of load and crowding, I'm just reading your para here, the Anglia Rusk gives the passenger loads in 2007, the in-city load factor 113%. I mean, generally, how would you describe the loading and the level of crowding on the main peak trains?
On the intercity situation from which is last stop Colchester, we're putting some extra coaches in, and we may well have to turn 2 of the trains into higher density trains. I mean, this franchise was planned just after the Iraq War, when there were about 30,000 jobs that had gone in the city, so it was a fallow year. And you should not assume that commuting grows inexorably. I mean, Liverpool Street had 23% less people coming into it in 1993 than it did in 1989. It just about got up to the 1989 levels. It's not helped that the trains in the meantime have moved from having about 360 people in 12-seat compartments, some of which were probably locked out because they've been vandalised, down to I think it's 280 seats on one of the latest trains. So we are very tight between about 8 o'clock in the morning and 8:45 into Liverpool Street, and the work that we've done for H-Sloss, which is being negotiated with the department, gives about 10% additional seats during that time. Outside that time, it's longer trains, which are 33% extra capacity, and over the peak 3 hours you can get 25% extra capacity in, which against a fairly mature corridor, I mean the building was really done in the 1960s adjacent to the stations out as far as Colchester. And you actually find, one of the things about Essex that we find is that people don't move when they retire in the way that they do. You might be moving, sir. But I find myself in the same situation. But the actual mobility around, certainly in South Essex, is very, very low indeed. if you clog the houses up with people that have retired and
Yes.
are living until they're 90,
Yes.
like my parents,
Yes.
rather than 83 or 84, then there isn't the pressure there. But if that changes, that's one thing that could add to demand, I guess. It has changed sort of west of London, because if you live in the sort of real growth areas west of London, you've got such an asset, you probably realise it when you retire to a greater extent. I think the other thing is, obviously, is that if we actually get some local jobs into Essex and more inward investment along this corridor, and there's a bit, but it's not the strongest area.
And there are some pockets of housing growth on here, but they're not the biggest pockets in the east of England.
Well, that's why you get the contrast between West Anglia.
Yeah,
Well, we haven't got
exactly.
Stansted here, right?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
we better not start talking about that, because there are different views on expansion there.
Yeah.
But I mean, that goes for 37% to 2015, and this goes to 8%. The growth has probably been inexorably rather higher than forecasted on the A12 corridor. I would say. And a lot of our focus in the A12 is actually on sorting out the peak hour and peak 3 hours on the A12, rather than, say, from southeast Essex, where the market isn't as buoyant.
The bottom line is, I guess, that the extra capacity you're putting in through the H-loss, the longer trains and so on, the peak and the like, isn't going to make that much difference to the traffic on the A12.
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean,
people will simple-mindedly say, "Oh, we just need to put a few more carriages on and reduce the fares on the railway, and that will solve the problem on the A12." But I mean, that isn't going to be the case.
well, not with 75% of car on it and 6 or 7% on train. That's perhaps up to 20% on train. But I mean, it's three times more difficult to solve it by the train than it is to on the road.
So I've just picked that thought up. My reading of the passenger side, what was said in the Russ, was essentially for the Great Eastern route, that given continuing modest growth in demand, what's planned through the H-loss and beyond just does a wee bit better than the demand with which you're going to be faced. In other words, the crowding comes down slightly over the peak.
Yes.
But you haven't got any capacity beyond that.
That's why in one sentence we start mentioning about possible lines along the Central Line, or people have talked about something along the A120 corridor. And I mean, I think you need to bring any capacity in to involve Chelmsford, because it's such a huge point, and there are big aspirations for growth in Chelmsford now, which there haven't particularly been in the last 10 years, although it's actually happened. I was looking at the numbers through Chelmsford. We've grown about 40% in the last 10 years.
Speculative aside from Chernham, not to be reported in the Essex Chronicle, but you can stick it in. Chelmsford, if it goes on like it is, will get to look like Victoria Station in London, which is a closure of the platforms at times because they're getting very crowded.
Well, at 8 o'clock with the school's traffic coming in, and that's another reason why I'm quite keen on sorting it out outside Chelmsford, which I think would work, because I don't think you would actually sort overall demand out within Chelmsford. And taking 500 cars off the roads into Chelmsford Station in the peak hour would be helpful, wouldn't it, in the general?